Hello, this is Hector Herrero, and we will continue here with the second part of our podcast dedicated to choosing the right sites where radiopharmaceutical trials needs more than oncology experience. In this second part, we will move from the broader challenge of site readiness into the practical elements that determine whether a site can truly execute a radiopharmaceutical trial. We will focus on the workflow integration, early warning signs, and the risk of moving forward without full feasibility. So let's start work now a little bit about, although we have already mentioned this before, workflows and therapeutic expertise. So in traditional oncology trials, therapeutic expertise is often the primary selection criteria. In radiopharma or experience at Fortria suggests that workflows and cross-functional coordination are just as critical, at least as critical as the therapeutic expertise. Dr. Matoshita, how would you compare the importance of workflows versus therapeutic expertise in radiopharmaceutical trials?
Both are essential and neither can fully compensate for the absence of the other. Therapeutical expertise ensures that patients are appropriately selected, treated, and monitored. However, radiopharmaceutical therapies are highly dependent on operational execution. Even the most experienced investigator cannot overcome poorly coordinated workflows, missing dosing windows, or failure in the communication between departments. At the same time, excellent workflows alone are not sufficient if the clinical team lacks experience with the disease, treatment strategy, or patient management challenges associated with the study. The strongest sites are those that combine clinical excellence with operational maturity. In my experience, successful radiopharmaceutical trials occur when expert clinical decision making is supported by reliable, standardized, and highly coordinated process.
From an operational perspective, we see challenges when handoffs between oncology, nuclear medicine, pharmacy, imaging, and radiation safety aren't clearly defined. Paulo, how important is that cross-departmental coordination from a Mr. Investigator point of view? How you have seen this in your work at hospitals?
From an investigator's perspective, cross-departmental coordination is essential in radiopharmaceutical trials and, in many cases, just as critical as therapeutic expertise. In traditional oncology studies, clinical expertise can sometimes compensate for operational gaps. But in radiopharma, that flexibility disappears. The therapy itself depends on a tightly choreographed workflow linking oncology, nuclear medicine, pharmacy, imaging, and radiation safety. If one handoff fails, the treatment is directly impacted. Clinically, this matters in three ways. The patient access, you may identify and consult the right patient, but if imaging, radio tracer preparation, or dosing windows are not aligned, the treatment opportunity can be lost. Then safety. Investigators remain clinically accountable, but execution depends on other departments, especially when you have different sites or different centers, like one, the oncology, the other, the nuclear medicine, the radiology. If those roles and responsibilities are unclear, safety risk increases regardless of experience. Finally, decision making. Imaging timing and consistency often inform efficacy and toxicity assessments. When workflows break down, expertise alone cannot compensate. And this is particularly important in early phase studies where you have a heavy burden on imaging and for the dosimetry data. So these kind of operational details become even more important. So that's why in radiopharma, expertise and workflows are inseparable. Strong investigators need a strong system and processes. Fortria's focus on sites with proven coordination among the different teams helps ensure investigators can focus on patients and science, not becoming operational firefighters.
Early feasibility is a major focus for us at Fortria because radiopharma studies leaves very little room for reactive fixes, as we have been discussing during the last few minutes. Paulo, what are the early warning signs that tell you a site might not be ready for a radiopharmaceutical trial?
That's a very important question. Thanks, Hector. In radiopharmaceutical trials, the early warning signs usually show up very early, often during the feasibility, if you know what to look for. The issue is that once the study starts, there is very little room to fix these structural gaps. One of the first red flags that I listen for is when a site talks in generalities instead of walking through concrete workflows. If the site cannot clearly explain how the radiopharmaceutical is received, prepared, administered, and disposed of, include what happens if there is a delay, that tells us a lot that the processes are not fully thought through, and maybe that the site doesn't have standard operational procedures for handling radioisotopes and radiopharmaceuticals. In radiopharma studies, that lack of clarity almost always translates into problems later. Another big signal is weak cross-department coordination. If oncology, nuclear medicine, pharmacy, radiology, and radiation safety are clearly operating in silos during feasibility discussions, so for instance, you cannot make them all sit together for 5-10 minutes in a meeting, you can expect friction once real patients and tight timelines are involved. Radiopharma trials only work when those teams function as a one integrated unit. I'm also cautious when sites rely heavily on diagnostic nuclear medicine experience and assume that experience will translate smoothly into therapeutical trials. The regulatory, safety, and documentation requirements are very different. Underestimating that complexity is a frequent source of delays and deviations. Radiation safety engagement is another key indicator. If radiation safety officers are only peripherally involved or planned to be brought in later, that is a sign that sites might be reacting rather than preparing for potential issues and problems. Finally, mindset matters a lot. When a site says, we will figure it out once the study starts, that's a serious red flag for me. Radiopharmaceutical trials don't tolerate improvisation well. The sites that succeeded are the ones that prepare early, test workflows in advance, and understand that readiness has to be demonstrated, not assumed.
I believe, Paulo, you have really highlighted a lot of critical aspects here. And based on our experience, where we often hear sites saying, we will adapt when the study starts. Well, that may work for other clinical trials, but operationally, that's something that it is not really possible when talking about radiopharmaceutical studies, simply because it will be extremely risky for the study. Dr. Matushita, what clinical or operational red flags do you pay closest attention to early on?
That's a good question. One of the biggest red flags is when key stakeholders are absent from early feasibility discussions. If nuclear medicine, pharmacy imaging, radiation safety, or nursing teams are not actively involved, it usually indicates that the site has not fully evaluated the study requirements. Another warning sign is uncertainty regarding regulatory approvals or isotope authorizations. If a site cannot clearly explain its licensing status or the process required to obtain additional approvals, delays are likely to occur. I also pay close attention to workflow discussions. If team cannot confidently describe how the radiopharmaceutical will be received, prepared, administered, monitored, and documented. Finally, I become concerned with sites rely heavily on their oncology experience and assume they can solve problems as they arise. Radiopharmaceutical trials demand preparation, not improvisation. The most successful sites are those that identify and address potential challenges before the study starts.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Matushita. Let's focus now on the risk and how we can escape certain risk. So at Fortria, we see that when sites are selected without a full-fledged feasibility checks, the consequences can be significant. Not only delays, but lost dosing opportunities, regulatory challenges, and that is something that we have learned by experience during all this year doing radiopharmaceutical clinical trials. Dr. Matushita, from a clinical standpoint, what risks arise when feasibility is incomplete or rushed? What would make a good site fit for a radiopharmaceutical trial in your experience?
When feasibility is incompleted or rushed, the consequences can affect every aspect of the study. The first risk is patient impact. These patients often have advanced disease and limited therapeutical options. If operational issues lead to missed treatment windows, delayed imaging, or canceled administrations, valuable opportunities may be lost. The second risk involves protocol compliance and data quality. Small workflow deficiencies can result in protocol deviations, inconsistent imaging acquisitions, incomplete documentation, or dosing delays that ultimately affect study outcomes. There are also regulatory and safety risks. Missing approvals, inadequate radiation safety procedures, or insufficient staff training may lead to compliance issues that are difficult to correct once the trial is active. For me, a good pharmaceutical trial site is one that demonstrates readiness across multiple dimensions. It has appropriate infrastructure, regulatory preparedness, experienced multidisciplinary teams, strong communication between departments, and well-established workflows that have been tested before the first patient arrives. The best sites do not simply have the necessary resources, they understand how to integrate those resources into a reliable system and consistently delivers high quality patient care, protocol compliance, and scientific excellence.
So, from the CRO perspective, those risks often translate into losing treatment windows, into losing imaging, seeing more and more protocol deviations. We may need to replace the sites in the middle of the study. Paulo, from your perspective, why is recovering from these issues particularly difficult in radiopharmaceutical trials?
Recovering from these issues is particularly difficult in radiopharmaceutical trials because the system simply does not have much elasticity built into it. We just discussed this a little bit before. So, in conventional oncology studies, if something goes wrong early, you can often correct the course. You may retrain a site, adjust scheduling, absorb a delay without losing the patient or the treatment opportunity. However, dealing with radioisotopes, that flexibility disappears. When feasibility is incomplete or rushed, the first thing we see clinically is lost dosing opportunities. Isotopes are produced on fixed schedules, have short half-lives, and are tightly linked to patient readiness. If a site is not fully prepared, you cannot easily reschedule. The drug expires, the slot is lost, and the patient may no longer be eligible by the time everything is corrected. And on my experience, that leads to two major impacts. One, more clearly, is the project timelines and the project execution from a management perspective. But second and most important is that patients might lost the trust in the study and becomes even harder to find patients after those delays and treatment loss happen. Then protocol deviations become very hard to contain. Workflow gaps between oncology, nuclear medicine, imaging, and radiation safety tend to repeat themselves. Once those patterns are established, they generate ongoing compliance and safety risks, not one off events. Third, replacing a site mid-study is especially disruptive in radiopharma. New sites require infrastructure validation, regulatory approvals, radiation safety clearance, workflow training, and so forth. That takes time, and during that time, enrollment and dosing momentum stalls. From a clinical perspective, the most important point is that many of these issues are preventable. So, doing a full feasibility and pre-study assessments help identify whether a site can truly operate as an integrated system under real-world constraints. When that step is skipped, the trial absorbs the risk later, often at much higher cost to timelines, data, and patients.
Thank you, Paulo. And really big thank you to both of you, Dr. Matushita and Dr. Paulo Nunes. Thank you very much because I believe that what this discussion reinforces is that radiopharmaceutical trials require a different mindset. I think this is very visible and is extremely easy to see when we have the right experience. So oncology experience is essential, but it's not enough on its own. Infrastructure must be verified, workflows must be proven, and I want to really underline this: the workflow must be proven, and the sooner the feasibility happen, the better. At Factoria, this is exactly where we focus our efforts, helping sponsors to identify risk early and support sites in becoming truly radiopharma ready. In our next episode, we will take this conversation further and focus on logistics and the race against time. What happens once the isotope leaves the supplier and the clock starts ticking. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Paulo Nunes and Dr. Matushita, for sharing your experience. It's been really, really a big pleasure. And thank you to everyone listening to this Fortria podcast series.